I want you to picture something for a moment. A quiet room, early in the morning, doing something small and ordinary, the kind of thing you've done 1,000 times without thinking about it. It's not dramatic. Nobody's crying. Nothing's on fire. There's no emergency to point to. It's just quiet. The kind of quiet that used to mean peace and somewhere along the way started meaning something closer to absence. That's the moment I want to start with, because I think more people are living inside a version of that moment than most of us are willing to say out loud. We don't talk about it much. I want to pause here for just a second because I know some of what I've just described might be landing close to home for some of you, and I don't want to rush past it. If any part of this is resonating, take a moment, sit with it. There's no need to have an answer right now. But if you're the kind of person who finds these stories useful, who likes hearing how other people actually got through the parts of life that don't come with instructions, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe before we go any further, because there's a lot more of this story left, and honestly, a lot more stories like it waiting after this one. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, not in some abstract algorithm sense, though sure, there's that too, but in a more direct way. It tells me these stories are actually reaching people, actually landing somewhere, and that keeps me motivated to keep telling them honestly instead of dressing them up. I'll be honest, when I first started sharing pieces of my own life like this, I wasn't sure anyone would care, wasn't sure a story about an ordinary person going through an ordinary hard stretch of life would be worth anyone's time when there's no shortage of louder, flashier things competing for attention out there. But it turns out a lot of people are quietly hungry for exactly this. Not spectacle, just honesty, just someone willing to say the true, unglamorous parts of a hard chapter out loud instead of skipping straight to the tidy resolution. So, if that's what's kept you listening this far, subscribing is a small thing that means a lot, and it makes sure you don't miss where this story goes, or the ones that come after it. Alright, back to it, because there's a fair bit more to tell, and I don't want to leave you hanging on the part that comes next, which, honestly, is where things really started to shift. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting at a kitchen table in a house you've lived in for 34 years, and the coffee is hot, and the morning light is coming through the same window it always has, and everything around you is exactly as familiar as it was the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that, and yet somehow, in the specific silence of that particular morning, you realize that familiar and comfortable are not the same thing, and haven't been for a while, and that the life you've been calling fine has actually been calling itself something else entirely when you weren't paying close enough attention. That's not a crisis. That's just a Wednesday morning, if you let it be. For about a year, I let it be. My name is Wyatt. I'm 71 years old, and 11 months ago I did something that everyone who knew me expected would take me another 5 years to work up the courage for. I packed 2 bags, sold a house full of 34 years' worth of accumulated living, and moved to a city in the Philippines that I'd never visited before the year prior. A city I had, if I'm being honest, barely heard of, 18 months before I landed there with a one-way ticket, and more uncertainty than I'd felt since I was 23 years old, and newly arrived in a life I didn't yet know how to navigate. If that kind of story is something you want to follow along with, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's more of it coming, and I think some of it will say something you've been needing to hear. I should explain who I am first, or at least who I was before any of this, because the person who made this decision didn't arrive at it from nowhere. I spent 38 years as a structural engineer, most of that time working for a mid-sized firm in Portland, Oregon, where I'd moved after graduate school because a job materialized there, and I was 27 and didn't have strong feelings yet about where exactly I was supposed to plant myself. Portland turned out to be one of those places you stay longer than you planned, because leaving keeps getting postponed by one more thing worth staying for. A career that kept building on itself. A house in a neighborhood I genuinely liked. A daughter named Mallory, who grew up there and still lives there now, 40 minutes from where I used to live, close enough that we saw each other regularly, but not so close that either of us ever felt crowded. Claire and I met when I was 32 and she was 30, at a function neither of us wanted to attend, introduced by a mutual friend who I've since decided was owed a considerable debt of gratitude for the insistence. We had Mallory 3 years into the marriage, and then we tried for another child for several years after that. The specific, quiet grief, of which I won't detail here, except to say that it shapes a marriage in ways you don't fully understand while you're inside it, only after. Claire and I divorced when Mallory was 11. It wasn't a violent ending. It was more like a careful, exhausted mutual agreement that we'd become two people who lived in the same house and loved the same child, and had less and less of anything else connecting us than we'd had 5 years before. We managed it, I think, as decently as two people can manage the unraveling of something they both once believed would last. We remained cordial for Mallory's sake, and then eventually cordial for our own sakes too, because neither of us was actually the villain in the story, and we both eventually knew it. I raised Mallory largely on my own from that point, shared custody on paper, but weighted heavily toward me in practice, because Claire's career took her to Seattle and then to the Bay Area, a progression that involved more travel than was compatible with a school-age child's schedule. I don't say that as a criticism. Claire was present for the important things, summer breaks and holidays and every school event she could manage from wherever she happened to be. And Mallory grew up knowing her mother loved her, even if she couldn't always be the one picking her up after school. What I raised, mostly, was a self-sufficient kid who turned into a self-sufficient adult, the kind of woman who manages her own life so competently that asking for help feels to her like a personality failure, which I recognize because she got it from me. Retirement happened at 68, 3 years ahead of what I'd planned, because of a diagnosis that reordered my sense of timeline. Nothing immediately life-threatening, a heart condition that required medication and management, and, more to the point, a cardiologist who sat me across a desk and said, with the flat patience of someone who'd had this conversation before, that stress was going to be the thing that determined how the next decade played out for me more than almost any other variable he could measure, and that if I was going to retire eventually anyway, the logic of doing it now rather than later was worth taking seriously. I took it seriously. I cleared out my office over a weekend, which was somehow lonelier than I'd expected it to be, and came home to a house that had always been quiet, and discovered it was now quiet in an entirely different way. The way a space feels quiet when it's stopped having a purpose rather than just a person in it. The first year of retirement was manageable. I had projects. I had a list, the kind of list you keep for years, of things you'll do when you have time, and I worked through it methodically, the same way I'd approached engineering problems for 4 decades, systematically, with documentation. I renovated the back deck. I took a woodworking class at the community center. I drove down to see Mallory on weekends when she wasn't traveling for work herself, and we'd have dinner. She'd show me whatever project she was currently absorbed in. I'd update her on whatever I was building or reading, and we'd part feeling like we'd successfully conducted the maintenance of a relationship we both valued, but neither of us was especially practiced at sustaining through long, unstructured conversation. We're similar enough in temperament that we've always communicated better through activity than through sitting still and talking, which is fine as a working arrangement and something I recognized during that first retirement year I should probably diversify before it became the only tool I had. The second year was harder. The list had run out. The deck was done. The woodworking class had finished. I signed up for another one.
and then stopped going halfway through because I realized I was woodworking not because I had any particular attachment to woodworking, but because I needed somewhere to be from 9 to 11 on Tuesday mornings, which is a reason to drive somewhere, but not, I discovered, a reason you can sustain for very long before the whole thing starts to feel like a very involved form of killing time. I had a neighbor named Frank who'd lived across the street for 12 years, and we'd gotten into the habit, somewhere in the middle of that second retirement year, of meeting for coffee on weekday mornings, not every day, 3 or 4 times a week, at a small place about a mile from the house. Frank was retired too, a former high school biology teacher, and he talked about his grandchildren more than anything else, with genuine pleasure, the kind of light that comes into a person's eyes when the subject is something they love, without complication. I liked Frank. I liked those coffees. But I also recognized, sitting across from him 3 mornings a week, that the shape of my day had shrunk to the point where that hour of coffee was the thing I was unconsciously structuring everything else around, the anchor point of a schedule that had otherwise lost most of its definition, and that wasn't Frank's fault, and wasn't a failure of anything except time, which has a way of making space that you don't always know how to fill. Mallory noticed the way adult children of single parents notice things, quietly and from a distance, gathering information without announcing she's doing it. She mentioned once, over dinner, that I seemed, in her word, restless, and asked if I'd thought about traveling anywhere. I said I'd thought about it. She asked whether I'd thought about it specifically enough to actually book anything. I said I was getting there. She gave me the look that she's given me since she was approximately 14 years old, the look that says she knows the difference between getting there and stalling, and that she loves me enough not to push, but not enough to pretend she doesn't see it. What actually put the Philippines in my head was, of all things, a doctor.
It happened without much warning, the way these things usually do, a sudden and frightening development that arrived in the middle of an otherwise ordinary stretch of time and, for a while, threatened to undo a lot of the confidence I'd built up about the choice I'd made. I remember the specific fear underneath the physical fear, which was less about the immediate situation and more about a question I hadn't fully let myself sit with before that moment. What happens now, this far from the people and systems I used to be able to lean on without a second thought? That question turned out to have a better answer than I'd feared. Help arrived faster than I expected. Care turned out to be more capable and more affordable than the version of it I'd carried around in my head, built mostly out of second-hand worry rather than actual information. I came out the other side of it shaken but fine, and with something I hadn't expected to gain from a frightening experience, which was a much clearer, calmer sense of what would actually happen if something went wrong again, replacing an abstract fear with concrete, reassuring knowledge. I think that's an underrated gift, honestly, the kind you only get by going through the hard version of a question instead of just wondering about it from a safe distance. I no longer had to imagine what an emergency would look like in this new life. I knew because I'd lived it, and the knowing turned out to be far less frightening than the not knowing had been. Documentary. I'd gotten into the habit of watching documentaries late in the evenings, the kind of thing I'd never made time for while I was working, and one evening I ended up watching something about cities in Southeast Asia that had become destinations for long-term travelers. And a portion of it was set in a city on the coast of the Philippines, one of those places that looked, on a screen at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, almost artificially beautiful, the kind of light that makes you think the camera is doing something to the colors, until you read enough later to understand it isn't. I didn't do anything about it that night. I closed my laptop and went to bed and thought about it in that half-dreaming way you think about things when you haven't fully decided whether they belong in the category of real ideas or just pleasant passing images. But it persisted.
The way certain things persist when your mind has become quiet enough that there isn't enough noise to crowd them out. I started reading, first casually, then with the increasing specificity that tells you, before you've admitted it to yourself, that you've already made a decision at some level and are now building the justification structure around it. I read about the retirement visa options, the SIR-V, the Special Resident Retirees Visa, which turned out to be more straightforward than I'd expected, designed precisely for people in my position, retirees from abroad looking to establish long-term residency, with a relatively modest deposit requirement and a bureaucratic process that, while not trivial, was manageable for someone willing to approach it methodically. I read expat forums the way I used to read technical specifications at work, in long sittings, looking for the inconsistencies between what the optimists claimed and what the people further down the thread actually reported experiencing. I read about healthcare because that was the variable I knew would determine everything else, found information about private hospitals in major Philippine cities that were internationally accredited and staffed by physicians trained at foreign institutions, found the names of insurance providers specifically serving foreign retirees in the region, priced it out in detail. I took a trip, 3 weeks, exploratory, framed to Mallory as a vacation, because I wasn't ready to describe it more accurately than that, until I'd seen enough to know whether accuracy was warranted. I landed in Manila, spent 2 days letting the city work on me, which it did immediately and in ways I hadn't expected. The density of it, the noise and the movement and the heat, and the way the city seemed to conduct itself at a pace entirely its own, not quite like anything I'd experienced in Southeast Asian cities I'd visited before, somewhere between organized and improvised, deeply alive in a way that felt almost aggressive after the specific quiet I'd come from. Then I went south. I'd read about a city called Dumaguete on the island of Negros Oriental, a smaller city, a university town, known among the expat community for a combination of things that kept appearing in forum posts, like a recurring description: affordable, manageable in scale, genuinely friendly rather than performatively hospitable, with a waterfront boulevard that people described in terms that made it sound like a place you'd go to sit and watch the world rather than be processed through it. I flew down from Manila on a small regional carrier, the kind of short flight where you're aware of the altitude the whole time, and landed in an airport small enough that I was outside with my bag before I'd properly registered that the journey was over. My first 3 days in Dumaguete, I will be honest, were disorienting in a specific, manageable way. I didn't know where anything was. My instinct for navigating a place hadn't transferred here the way I'd expected it to. The mental map you develop automatically in a familiar city based on landmarks and patterns and the unconscious calibration of which direction feels like downtown. None of that worked. I walked the boulevard that first evening and felt, quite precisely, like a tourist, the specific feeling of moving through a place that is not yet organized around you in any way, where every choice is deliberate rather than habitual, and where nothing is waiting for you by name. I ate at a restaurant near the water and ordered the first thing on the menu I recognized well enough to feel confident about, and ate it alone, watching the evening come down over the strait, and I was aware, in a way that was not quite loneliness but adjacent to it, that I was extremely far from Portland. I didn't let that be the last data point. That was important. The decision not to let the discomfort of the first few days calcify into a conclusion before I'd given it enough time to become something else. I stayed. I walked the same streets multiple mornings in a row until they stopped feeling like a maze and started feeling like a neighborhood. I found a small coffee shop near the university that opened early and had decent Wi-Fi, and a proprietor, a man named Ronnie, somewhere in his late 40s, who had the specific kind of easygoing warmth that isn't performing itself, the kind that comes from someone who is simply, genuinely at ease in his own establishment, and doesn't need anything from you except that you enjoy it. I went back to that coffee shop every morning for the rest of the trip. By the third visit, Ronnie knew how I took my coffee. By the fifth, he'd started saving me the corner table near the window without being asked, the one with the view of the street, and enough space to spread papers, which he'd apparently noted I preferred. By the end of the first week, he'd introduced me to two of his regulars, a retired Filipino engineer named Ernesto, who spoke English with a precision that made me feel slightly underdressed conversationally, and a former American professor named Dennis, who'd been in Dumaguete for 7 years, and who, when I told him this was a scouting trip and asked him whether it was actually livable for the long term, looked at me with the patient expression of someone who'd answered this question before and said, with no particular drama, "I left Cincinnati 7 years ago, and I haven't had a moment of genuine regret." That answer enough. I told him it was a start. Dennis spent an afternoon walking me around the neighborhoods he knew best, pointing out the specific practical geography that doesn't appear in any forum post because it's the kind of knowledge that accumulates only from actually living somewhere. Which markets had the best produce? Which hospital handled what level of care? Where the English language library was, a small but real one attached to a cultural center, which I made note of with the specific pleasure of someone whose relationship with libraries has been ongoing since childhood. He showed me a residential area a few streets back from the boulevard, where a number of expats had settled. Small houses and apartment buildings set back from the main road in a way that gave them a surprising amount of quiet for how centrally located they were. He showed me the park where people gathered in the early mornings for walking and exercise, the outdoor market on Saturdays, the church at the center of the old town that had been standing since the Spanish colonial period and still filled most Sundays in a way that clearly meant something to the neighborhood around it, regardless of your own relationship with organized religion. I met Ernesto's wife, a retired schoolteacher named Glo, on my second week, at a gathering at their home that Dennis had mentioned almost as an afterthought, a kind of informal monthly thing where a rotating collection of friends and neighbors came through for food and conversation, and that specifically Filipino form of hospitality that I was starting to understand was not a performance of warmth, but simply the default operating temperature of a certain kind of household. I walked in as a stranger and walked out 3 hours later, knowing more of Glo's neighbors by first name than I knew of the people on my own street in Portland, and if that tells you something about what I'd been missing, it should, because it told me something too. Glo asked me at some point during that evening whether I had children, and when I told her about Mallory, she wanted to know everything: how old, what she did for work, whether she'd visited the Philippines, whether she approved of the trip. I told her Mallory was 33, managed sustainability programs for a company in Portland, had not visited the Philippines, and was reserving judgment on the trip until she had more information. Glo laughed at that, in a way that said she recognized the dynamic immediately, the adult child calibrating their approval carefully, the parent reading the calibration and working with it. She told me, with the directness of someone who'd raised children of her own and come through the other side of their opinions, that in her experience, the children always came around when they visited, because there was something about actually seeing a place rather than imagining it that resolved arguments that facts alone couldn't. I filed that away and thought about it for weeks after I flew home. Home, by then, had started to feel like a word doing work it was no longer entirely suited for. I landed back in Portland in the early morning. the familiar gray of a Pacific Northwest sky waiting for me above the tarmac, drove the familiar roads from the airport to the familiar house, and sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside in the specific way I'd started noticing myself doing when returning from somewhere that had interested me more than the place I was returning to. The house was fine. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The kitchen was clean, the mail was stacked neatly because the neighbor kid I paid to collect it had done exactly as instructed, and the whole thing had the quality of a stage set between performances, maintained and correct, and waiting for something to happen in it again. I made coffee and sat at my own kitchen table and thought about Ronnie's coffee shop and the corner table with the view of the street. I spent the next 6 months in a state of very deliberate, very careful preparation, because the way I'd handled decisions my entire professional life was to front-load the uncertainty, work through the unknowns in advance, rather than encountering them as surprises on the other side of a choice you've already made. I contacted the Philippine Retirement Authority and went through the documentation requirements for the SRRV with the same systematic attention I'd given engineering specifications, which turned out to be exactly the right temperament for the process. I found an immigration attorney, a woman in Manila recommended by someone on an expat forum, who handled the application with a thoroughness that suggested she'd done it hundreds of times, without letting it become careless. I engaged her and let her manage the process. I sat down with my financial planner of 16 years, a man named Steve, who'd seen me through the divorce and the early retirement and the cardiac diagnosis, and who had therefore earned, I felt, the right to respond to any major life decision with his actual opinion rather than just supportive facilitation. He responded to this one with a series of questions so precise they were practically an engineering review, and I had answers prepared for most of them. And for the ones I didn't, we spent 2 more meetings developing them. The cost structure in Dumaguete was, compared to Portland, almost implausible. Rent for a well-situated 2-bedroom apartment near the boulevard ran somewhere between 12 and 18,000 pesos, depending on the building, which at the time of my planning came to roughly $215 to $320 a month. Utilities modest. Food, if you shopped and ate the way people who actually lived there did, rather than the way tourists did, genuinely inexpensive in a way that Steve, reviewing the numbers, described as hard to argue with, in the flat tone he uses when something is more favorable than he'd predicted. Healthcare was the conversation I knew was coming. I researched the major private hospitals in Dumaguete and the surrounding region, found that the quality of care described by long-term expats was consistently better than the forum's framing of adequate might suggest. Found an internationally underwritten health insurance plan for foreign retirees that covered hospitalization, major procedures, and emergency evacuation to Manila or beyond if needed, priced it against what I'd been paying for supplemental coverage in the US, and found that the difference was manageable in a way that removed my last genuinely serious objection to the plan. Telling Mallory was the part I'd been building toward and not quite reaching for months. We had dinner at her apartment in Portland, a dinner I'd suggested and she'd made, which already told her something was coming, because I only suggest dinners at her place when I want to be somewhere I can't stand up and leave. I laid it out plainly, the way she'd always told me she preferred. No softening preamble, just the actual information in order. I was moving to Dumaguete. I had the visa process underway. I had the insurance figured out. I had a rough budget mapped out. I had Ernesto's phone number as an on-the-ground contact, and Dennis's, and Ronnie's, though Ronnie's role was more coffee provider than emergency contact, which she did not find as funny as I did. She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that Mallory uses for actual processing rather than for dramatic effect, because she's not a dramatic effect kind of person. Then she asked whether I understood what I was asking her to do, which was to accept that her only living parent was going to be a 14-hour flight away rather than a 40-minute drive, and whether I understood the difference between those two things in a scenario where something went wrong. I told her I understood it completely, that I'd thought about almost nothing else for months, that I'd built the entire decision around having a real, specific answer to exactly that concern, rather than just a feeling that it would probably be fine. I walked her through the insurance documentation. I gave her Dennis's information and told her to call him herself if she wanted an independent account. She said she might actually do that. I told her I'd already given Dennis a heads up that she might call, because that's the kind of preparation that's easier to make in advance than apologize for later. She called Dennis. I found out about it a week later when Dennis emailed me to say he'd had a 45-minute conversation with your daughter, who is extremely thorough, and that she seemed reassured by what he'd told her, though she'd asked him to be direct about anything he thought was actually risky about the plan, and that he'd been honest about the adjustment period and about the healthcare limitations at the local level and about the things that were genuinely different rather than just romanticizing the whole thing, and that she'd seemed satisfied with the honest version. I thought about the kind of daughter who calls a stranger in another country to get an independent assessment of her father's plan, and I felt, in that moment, something that was equal parts proud and entirely not surprised. I sold the house in Portland in February. 34 years in that house, which means every room had its own archaeology, its own layers of what had happened in it, and who had been in it, and what version of me had stood in it, looking out the window at a different decade. Mallory was a child in that house. Claire and I were a marriage in that house, and then we were a divorce, and then I was a father alone in that house, figuring out how to be the only parent in a way that neither of us had planned for, but managed together in the cordial, decent way I described earlier. I spent the better part of 3 weekends going through things, the specific, slow archaeology of it, finding objects I'd forgotten I'd kept, finding objects I didn't remember acquiring, finding, in the back of a closet in the room that had been a study for 30 years, a box of drawings Mallory had made in elementary school that I had apparently saved with more care than I remembered applying at the time. I took a photo of every drawing before I packed the box. I don't know exactly why. It seemed important that they exist in a form that couldn't be lost to a move. Mallory would have told me I was being sentimental, which is probably accurate, and also, I think, entirely acceptable in a man standing in his own former study with a box of his daughter's third-grade artwork. The last day in the house was a Wednesday. The movers had been through the day before, and what remained were the objects I'd chosen to take or send ahead. 2 suitcases for the flight, a shipping box with the things that mattered enough to send but weren't needed immediately. I walked through each room once before I left, not lingering, not in any dramatic way, just marking it, the way I'd always marked the completion of a project, a quiet acknowledgement that something was done. Then I locked the door, handed the key to the realtor, and drove away, without looking back at it, not because the leaving wasn't hard, but because looking back felt like the wrong relationship to have with the direction I was actually going. Mallory met me for coffee that morning before my flight, the early one that would take me to San Francisco, and then to Tokyo, and then to Manila. She brought me a card she'd made herself, which she hasn't done since she was a child, with writing inside it that I won't repeat here, just for myself, words that were between a daughter and a father that morning in an airport coffee shop and didn't need a wider audience. I held onto that card for the entire 31 hours of flying, and it's in my apartment in Dumaguete right now, in a frame on the bookshelf, where I can see it from the chair I read in most evenings, which is the place in my apartment that most feels like mine. I landed in Dumaguete on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The heat hit me the same way it had the first time, immediate and total. The air different in its texture from anything Portland had ever produced. And I stood outside the small airport with my 2 bags while the car I'd arranged came around, and I was aware, quite clearly, of the feeling I'd come to think of as the honest feeling, the one underneath the prepared feeling, the one that wasn't confidence exactly, but wasn't fear exactly either. Something more like the sensation of having stepped off a known edge into space that might or might not hold you, and choosing to keep stepping regardless. Ronnie's coffee shop was the first place I went the next morning. He was there when I walked in, moving behind the counter with the same unhurried efficiency I'd remembered, and he looked up and recognized me immediately and said, in a tone that made no particular event of it, "You came back." I told him I was staying this time. He nodded, like this was a satisfactory development, and handed me a coffee, corner table already clear. The first month was the month I want to talk about most carefully, because it was the month that contained the most honesty about what this kind of move actually is, before it becomes the thing you eventually describe in retrospect as the best decision you ever made. The best decisions I've found don't feel like the best anything while you're inside the early part of them. They feel like an extended exercise in tolerating a discomfort you chose deliberately, while waiting to find out whether you chose correctly. I didn't know the city yet, not in the way you know a place that belongs to your daily life rather than your temporary presence in it. I got turned around in the market on my 3rd day and spent 30 minutes finding my way back to a street I'd been on the day before, which is a specific kind of small humiliation that tells you very clearly how much you don't yet know. I ordered things I couldn't fully identify and ate them anyway, mostly because asking more questions felt like more vulnerability than I was prepared to display to strangers whose opinion of me was still being formed. I spent more evenings alone in the first 2 weeks than I'd expected to, the city's friendliness notwithstanding, because friendliness is not the same as integration, and integration takes longer than friendliness. Dennis had warned me about this. He'd used the word threshold to describe a period in the middle of the first month, somewhere between day 15 and day 25, where the novelty of being somewhere new had worn off enough that you were experiencing the actual place rather than the exciting version of it you'd arrived with, and where the belonging you eventually developed hadn't yet caught up with the reality of being there. He called it the honest window, the period where you found out whether you were actually suited to this or whether you'd been in love with an idea that the idea itself couldn't fully sustain. He said most people he'd watched come through came out the other side of it. He'd also known a few who didn't, who left inside the first 2 months, and he didn't think less of them for it, he said, because the honest window was genuinely hard and not everyone was built for what it required. What it required, I found, was a specific kind of patience with yourself that didn't come naturally to me. A willingness to be in process rather than in outcome for longer than was comfortable. I'd spent my entire career in a discipline where progress was measurable, where you could look at a thing and assess objectively how far along it was and how far it still had to go. Integration into a new life doesn't work like that. There's no drawing to compare to. There's no specification to reference. You're just in it, and the days pass, and some of them produce small connections, and some of them produce nothing much, and the accumulation of that is what eventually becomes belonging. but you can't audit it while it's happening and expect to feel reassured. Ernesto became important to the first month in a way I hadn't entirely anticipated. He called me on my 4th day, unprompted, to ask how the apartment was settling in, whether I had everything I needed, whether there was anything about the practical logistics of the city I was still figuring out. He offered, with no particular ceremony, to take me to the Saturday market and show me how he and Glow shopped, the specific vendors they used and why, the things worth buying from the market versus the things better sourced from the grocery up on the main road. We went that Saturday and the one after, and then it just became a thing, the 3 of us, Ernesto and Glow and me at the market on Saturday mornings, and without any particular conversation about making it a ritual, it became one. The way certain things become rituals when they're doing more than just filling a time slot in your schedule. Glow knew. The way Glow seemed to know most things about the people in her immediate vicinity, that I was in the honest window, though she didn't use Dennis's word for it. She used her own framing, which was more direct. She told me one Saturday morning over coffee at a small place near the market that being new somewhere feels like wearing shoes that don't fit yet, and that you don't stop wearing them and go home, you wear them until they do, and that the secret is not to be angry at them for not fitting yet because they haven't had enough time to learn the shape of you. I thought about that for a long time afterward. It was better advice than most of what I'd read on forums. The coffee shop became the center of my mornings in a way that turned out to matter more than I'd expected. Ronnie's place, the corner table, the same coffee every day, a long black with enough strength to feel like a decision rather than a habit. I started arriving there with a book most mornings, which was different from how I'd operated in Portland, where I'd mostly read at home in the evenings, and the difference was that reading in public, in a place where people knew you well enough to greet you when you came in, but respected enough to leave you to your book, turned out to produce a quality of morning I hadn't known I was missing. You're alone, but not isolated. You're in the world, but not obligated to perform for it. It's a very specific kind of equilibrium that I'd somehow reached the age of 70 without discovering I needed. Ronnie introduced me to a man named Boy, which I'll note is a common enough nickname in the Philippines that its use requires no particular explanation. A retired fisherman in his mid-60s who came into the coffee shop most mornings and whose English was limited, but whose patience with slow, mutual comprehension was essentially unlimited. We developed, over the first month, a form of communication that was partly language and partly gesture and partly the shared vocabulary of 2 men who both had a strong enough preference for morning quiet that they could sit together in it without either one feeling the silence was something that needed filling. Boy's wife, a woman named Perla, who occasionally came with him, had better English and occasionally translated things for both of us, and occasionally just watched us communicate in our way, and seemed to find it more amusing than necessary to intervene. On my 23rd day in Dumaguete, which I know the exact date of because I'd written in a notebook I was keeping during that period, I woke up in the morning and lay in bed, running through the day in my head before getting up, which is a thing I used to do during my working years and had stopped doing entirely in the later part of retirement. And then I got up and made coffee and stood on my small balcony looking at the street below, and I noticed, quite specifically, that I was not trying to talk myself into the day. I was just in it, already in it, the way you're in a day that's actually yours, rather than a day you're working through. That's the only way I know how to describe what changed at some point in the 3rd week, the shift from enduring to inhabiting, from being in a place to being of it, at least in the early stages of what of it becomes. I went to Ronnie's, and Boy was already there, and Ronnie handed me my coffee without being asked, and I sat down with a book I was 3/4 through, and the morning went the way that mornings had started going, which was without incident, and without loneliness, and with a quality of ordinariness that was, I understood clearly, the entire thing. The entire thing was the ordinary morning, not the volcano in the distance, and not the colonial church on the boulevard, and not the beauty of the strait at sunset, though all of those things were real. It was this: the corner table, the coffee. Boy nodding good morning, Ronnie moving behind the counter, the street outside doing whatever it was doing. A morning that was mine, in the specific, unremarkable, entirely necessary way that mornings have to be yours before a place is actually home. About 6 weeks in, Ernesto mentioned that a community library near the university ran a small program helping adult learners with English literacy, and that they occasionally brought in volunteers to work with learners on practical reading comprehension, things like instructions, forms, basic documents, the kind of reading that wasn't about literature, but about navigating a modern life in a language you didn't grow up in. He mentioned it casually, in the way he mentioned things he thought might interest me, without presupposing that they would. I told him I'd go once to see what it was. I went on a Thursday afternoon and ended up staying for 2.5 hours, and going back the following Thursday, and the one after that, and every Thursday since except for 2 when I was traveling. The learners were adults of various ages, some in their 20s, some significantly older, all there for their own reasons. A woman in her 40s named Tessie, who was learning to read prescription instructions correctly after a medication confusion that had frightened her family enough to motivate the whole effort. A man in his early 30s named Jaime, who was trying to pass a certification exam for a job he wanted, and whose reading level needed to come up to meet the materials. Working with them was not complicated work. It was patient work, the kind of work where your job is mostly to slow down, find the specific obstacle, address it directly, and wait. I'd spent a career making complex things clear to people who needed to understand them but didn't have the technical vocabulary, which turns out to be excellent preparation for this kind of teaching. The skill transferred. Tessie got her medication instructions sorted by the 3rd week. She called me Sir Wyatt, which I told her was unnecessary, and she continued regardless. Jaime passed his certification exam in the 2nd month, and I know this because he came into the library on a Thursday afternoon holding the results page in a way that could only mean one thing: moving fast enough that he'd clearly been specifically waiting until Thursday to come show someone, and I was apparently the someone. I looked at the result, and I told him he'd earned it, which was true. He'd worked for it, and he shook my hand with both of his. The specific gesture of formality meeting genuine feeling that I'd come to understand as one of the things about this place that I found consistently moving without being able to fully explain why. The month that actually felt like home. The month I want to place precisely rather than leaving it as an approximation was the 3rd month. Not because anything dramatic happened in it, partly because nothing dramatic happened in it, which was itself the evidence. By the 3rd month, I was no longer noting, as I walked familiar streets, that they were familiar. I had stopped expecting to feel like a tourist, and stopped being surprised when I didn't. I had a rhythm. The rhythm was mine, not borrowed from anyone else's description of what life there should look like, not constructed from what the forums promised or what Dennis had told me to expect. It was composed of Ronnie's coffee shop and Boy's quiet company, and Ernesto and Glow on Saturday mornings, and the Thursday library sessions with Tessie and Jaime, and the evenings on the balcony, watching the light change over the street. One evening in that 3rd month, I was sitting on the balcony reading, and Ernesto and Glow appeared on the street below and called up to ask if I wanted to join them for dinner at a place nearby. A spontaneous invitation, no planning, just two people walking past who thought to include me in their evening. I called back down that I'd be right there, put down my book, went downstairs and joined them. We walked together the few streets to the restaurant, talking about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that doesn't need to accomplish anything because it's happening between people who are comfortable with each other. And I realized, somewhere on that walk, that comfortable was the right word, that I was comfortable in a way I hadn't been in the last years in Portland. Not because Portland was wrong, but because I'd outgrown the version of life I'd built there, in a way I hadn't been willing to name until moving somewhere else showed me the contrast. I called Mallory from the balcony that evening after I got back, which was morning for her, and I told her about the dinner, and she asked how things were going generally, the careful question she'd been asking every few days since I'd arrived. I told her they were going well, and I used the word home, unprompted, in describing something about the apartment. I said something like, when I got home, and she caught it, the way Mallory catches things, and she said quietly, you said home. I told her I'd noticed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, good, in the specific, brief, heartfelt way she has, when something she'd hoped for has arrived, and she doesn't want to make too much of it, in case it goes away. The healthcare moment came in the 5th month, rather than the 3rd, but I want to include it here because it was the moment that answered the question I knew had been sitting in the background of Mallory's careful weekly calls since I'd arrived. I had a cardiac episode. Not a significant one. The cardiologist who saw me was reassuring about that, but enough that it needed immediate assessment, and I called Ernesto, whose number was the first in my phone precisely for this, and he had me at the emergency room of the private hospital within 20 minutes, and was in the waiting room the entire time without being asked. The same way I imagine Bert was for Harold, the same way that certain people in new places become the people you can call at any hour and know they'll come. The care was thorough. The equipment was current. The physician who saw me had done part of her training in Singapore and spoke English with complete fluency and answered every question I asked with the kind of direct specificity.
These days, for the first time in longer than I'd like to admit, I wake up most mornings already thinking about the day ahead instead of just enduring it, already running through before my feet even hit the floor, whatever small thing needs doing, whoever's expecting to see me, whatever ordinary plan the day already has in motion, whether I have much of an opinion about it or not. I don't say that to suggest everything is perfect now, because it isn't, and I don't think any honest version of a story like this should pretend otherwise. There are still hard days. There's still an ache that never fully closes, and I've come to accept that it probably never will, and that this is all right, that it doesn't need fixing the way I once assumed it did. But underneath that ache, there's also now a real and steady pull toward tomorrow, something I'd lost for a long stretch of time and genuinely wasn't sure I'd get back. I did get it back, though, not all at once, and not because of any single dramatic decision, but because of a long accumulation of small, deliberate choices, each one modest on its own, that eventually added up to an entirely different life than the one I'd been quietly drowning in before.